Welcome back to Playful Whimsies, and today we have another chapter of Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. This is chapter 7, the Slow-Eater-Tiny-Bite-Taker Cure. And if you want to read along with me, it's page 91. So let's begin. Once upon a time, there was a little boy named Alan. He had curly brown hair and sturdy legs and a very shiny smile. One morning he sat down to breakfast, but instead of picking up his spoon and eating his mush and milk like a good little boy, he took a fork and began eating his cereal grain by grain. When his mother, certain that he had eaten all of his mush, brought him an egg, he was still on the 11th grain of cereal. Alan's mother said, "My goodness, you are poky this morning, dear. What's the matter? Is the mush too hot?" Then she noticed that Alan was eating his cereal with a fork. So she took the fork away and handed him the spoon, saying, "Now then, eat properly and hurry, or your egg will get cold." Alan took the spoon, but instead of filling it with mush, he daintily lifted one grain from the bowl and slowly brought it up to his mouth. His mother watched him for a few minutes and then said, "Well, eat a nice cold egg if you like, but I am going upstairs to sort the laundry, and when I come down, I want to find every bit of that mush and all of the egg eaten." Alan's mother went skipping upstairs and left Alan in the breakfast nook. As soon as his mother left the kitchen, Alan picked up the fork again and began eating his mush by the grain. In a little while, even a whole grain seemed too much, so he broke each grain in two, taking only half grains on the fork tines. He was so interested in his little tiny bites that he didn't hear his mother come in, and was very surprised when she suddenly whisked away his breakfast and sent him marching up to his room. And let me see if I can focus this a little better. I didn't realize it was not focused properly. I'm sorry if it's hard to read. I'm trying to keep it legible. At lunchtime, Alan's mother made cream of tomato soup. This was Alan's very favorite soup, but Alan, instead of eating it up quickly and asking for more, began floating little specks of cracker in the bowl. He floated, chased, and ate them one by one. At 2 o'clock, his mother stopped the little cracker crumb chase. Sadly clearing the table, and sent Alan up for a nap. At dinner that night, Alan cut his meat into such small pieces that his father looked over at him and said, "Perhaps you would like to borrow my magnifying glass. I am sure you are going to need it to see those infinitesimal bits of meat." Alan's mother said he has been like that all day, eating his mush grain by grain with a fork, floating tiny cracker crumbs in his soup and chasing and eating them one by one, and now this meat. "What is the matter with you, Alan?" Alan smiled his shining smile and said, "I guess I'm just a slow eater. I choke if I take larger bites." His mother said, "Nonsense, you were all right yesterday." Alan said sadly, "Yes, Mother, but that was yesterday." And he carefully cut the grain of corn into 4 pieces and delicately put the smallest piece into his mouth. The next morning he had not improved a bit, though his mother scolded and scolded. He took the smallest, slowest slowest bites imaginable. And to make matters worse, he sighed and gazed around the room between each bite. Alan's mother was very distressed. Not knowing what else to do, she called his friend, Mrs. Crankminer. "Good morning, Mrs. Crankminer," said Alan's mother. "This is Alan's mother, and I called to ask if you have ever had any difficulty with Wetherell about eating." Let's see what Mrs. Crankminer says. There we go. "Difficulty," said Miss Crankminer. "Just what kind of eating difficulty?" "Well," said Alan's mother, "Alan has suddenly taken to eating so slowly that if I didn't take his plate away, I'm sure it would take him approximately 12 hours to eat an average meal. He eats his cereal grain by grain, his soup drop by drop, and his meat pour by pour." "Goodness gracious, is the child ill?" asked Miss Crankminer. "No, he says that he feels well, and I have taken his temperature, and it is normal. I don't know what the trouble is," said Alan's poor, worried mother. Mrs. Crankminer said, "I certainly have no complaint about Wetherell's eating. My only difficulty is in getting him to stop. Yesterday before breakfast, he weighed 182 pounds, and his father has begun calling him Blimpy." "Oh my," said Alan's mother, "I guess you have a more serious problem than I have." And she hung up the phone. Then she called her friend Mrs. Wingsproggle. "Mrs. Wingsproggle," she said, "do you have any trouble with Pergonia at meal times?" Mrs. Wingsproggle said, enunciating very carefully, "No, not exactly trouble, but we do have to key up her to chew each mouthful 100 times. Sometimes she is forgetful and only chews her food about 93 times. I caught her stopping one day. Caught her stopping at 71. Alan's mother could already picture how disastrous it might have been if Alan heard Pergonia Wingsprockles chewing each bite 100 times, because if she multiplied each grain of mush in a dish by 100, it took into account the unbelievable slowness which Alan was able to chew. She realized he would die of slow starvation before a week had passed. Alan's mother hurriedly said goodbye to Mrs. Wingsproggle and hung up the phone. When she called Patsy's mother, she said, "Does Patsy eat everything that is put before her quickly and without urging?" Patsy's mother said, "Yes, she does. Why?" Alan's mother said, "Because Alan has taken to eating like a scared mosquito, and I don't know what to do." Patsy's mother said, "Call Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. She'll know what to do. You remember the radish cure, don't you?" Alan's mother was delighted. "Of course I do, and I'll call Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle right now." And she did. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "So Alan has become a slow-eater-tiny-bite taker, has he? I thought he looked a little pale this afternoon." Alan's mother said, "He is so pale that his father calls him his little doughboy, and I know he hasn't eaten more." Pardon me. Let me move this over. There we go. "Then a tablespoon of food in the last 2 days. What will I do, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle?" Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Don't worry about Alan. He'll be all right in a day or two. Let me see. It is Alan coming down the street right now, so I'll send him home with the Slow-Eater-Tiny-Bite-Taker dishes with him. Use the largest set for Alan's dinner tonight, the medium size for his meals tomorrow, and the small size for the next day, and the very small size for the last day. Serve him portions of food to fit the dishes. That will be 4 days in all, counting today. Though he may lose some weight, he will gain it right back. I may send for him on the last day, and no matter how he feels, let him come to my house. Alan's mother said, "Thank you very much, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. I'll do just as you say, and I will be so happy when he is cured." "I'll send Alan right home with the dishes," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "Now don't worry, simply follow my instructions." And Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said goodbye. After a little while, Alan came home carrying a large wicker basket. "Here's a present from Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, Mother," she said, "for me to be very careful with it." He set the basket on the kitchen floor and commenced to undo the fastening. His mother said, "No, dear, this is a present for me, and I think I'll put it aside for now. You run out and play until dinner. Goodness, you are pale. Run as fast as you can down to Patsy's house and put some roses into your cheeks." Alan's mother put the basket on the top shelf in the kitchen and shut the cupboard with nothing left for Alan to do but go out and play. However, instead of running down to Patsy's, he walked very, very slowly because he was tired from not having enough to eat. Just before dinner, Alan's mother took down the basket and opened it. There were 4 little sets of dishes. The largest set had a plate the size of a saucer, a cup like a small after-dinner coffee cup, and a small fork with a little spoon. The medium set had a plate just like a doll plate, a doll cup, and a very small fork and spoon. The small size had a plate the size of a silver dollar, a cup like a thimble, a fork like a match, and a spoon like a salt spoon. I'm sorry, I've never seen a salt spoon, so that's interesting. I guess that they had some of those things in more affluent neighborhoods. The tiny size set had a plate the size of a penny and a cup that would hold but a drop, a fork like a needle, and a spoon like a pen. Alan's dinner that night was served on the large set. He was given a baked potato as small as an egg, a piece of meat like a postage stamp, a slice of tomato, and a cup of milk. Alan was so interested in taking tiny bites that he didn't even notice his new dishes. He ate 1/3 of the potato, 1/6 of the meat, and 1 tomato seed, and drank about half a cup of milk. When he asked to be excused, his father looked at his saucer plate, still heaped with food, and started to say no. But Alan's mother quickly said, "Yes, dear, you may be excused, but you must play in your room until bedtime." The next morning, Alan's mother put a teaspoon of scrambled eggs, an inch square of toast on a medium-sized plate, and a tablespoon of orange juice in the doll cup. Alan loved the tiny fork and spoon because he was able to take such small bites that in 1 hour he had eaten but half of the egg and 1/3 of the toast. He did drink all of the orange juice. At luncheon and dinner he ate even less and took even smaller bites. He had turned a very pale green and was so tired he had to sit down all of the time. The next day his mother brought out the small dishes. On the dollar plate, she put 3 cornflakes, a piece of bacon the size of a snowflake, and a quarter of a teaspoon of an egg. In the thimble cup, she put 10 drops of cocoa. Alan was so tired he had to crawl to breakfast on his hands. He was happy about the tiny dishes, though, and gave his mother a very sickly edition of the shiny smile. He cut the cornflake into 13 pieces, ate part of one cornflakes into 13 pieces. He ate part of one. He ate a speck of egg, a nibble of bacon, and 5 drops of the Coca-Cola. He ate a speck of egg, a nibble of bacon, and 5 drops of cocoa, and then crawled in and lay on the couch. For lunch, he ate 7 drops of soup, 2 cracker crumbs, and enough milk to barely moisten his lips. For dinner, he ate 1 lima bean and drank 4 drops of... And here you get to see the picture of Alan crawling to the table. And there's his teeny tiny little set of food. Milk. He crawled right to bed after dinner. He had to rest 8 times on the way upstairs. By the morning, he was looking so tired, it took him almost half an hour to crawl downstairs to breakfast. His mother had the penny plate, the drop cup and the needle fork, and the pin spoon. On the penny plate, she had 1 grain of egg, 2 toast crumbs, and 2 blueberry jam seeds. She had a drop of milk in the 1 cup. Alan was so weak he had to lift the needle fork with both hands, but even so, he cut the 1 grain of egg in 2 and ate only 1 of the toast crumbs. He ate half the drop of milk and then lay down on the breakfast nook bench. Just then the telephone rang, and it was Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle for Alan. His mother had to carry him to the telephone and hold the big heavy telephone receiver. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle had great difficulty in hearing his weak, squeaky voice, and finally had to get up and talk to his mother. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "It is Alan's turn to exercise the spotty pony, and I would like him to come over here right away." Alan's mother told Alan, and he was very excited, but he was so weak that his mother had to carry him out and put him in his little red wagon. Fortunately, it was downhill all the way to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house, and when he got there, Dick Thompson and Herbert Pinchus were waiting for him out front. They lifted him out of his little red wagon and laid him across Spotty's back. Spotty turned his head. I wonder what's going to happen. Around and licked the top of Alan's head comfortingly. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle came out to her front porch to see him off, and it took much self-control for her to keep from laughing as Spotty started slowly off down the street with Alan lying on his back like a bag of cornmeal. All morning, Alan lay on Spotty's back, his face buried in his mane, while Spotty paced the streets. Several times, women rushed out of their houses to ask Alan if he was well or if he needed any help. Alan was very embarrassed and squeaked out, "I'm all right," and tried to sit up, but he was too weak. When 12 o'clock came, Alan was so tired that he knew he could not stay on Spotty's back another minute. So he guided the pony to his own front gate. Then he rolled off his back into the grass. There he lay like a wet sock bawling. His mother looked out the kitchen window, and seeing him laying there, she became frightened. She thought Spotty was a spirited horse, and he had bucked Alan off. She ran out and knelt beside him, kneeling. "Darling," she said, "are you hurt? Did that vicious horse throw you? How many times did he buck?" Alan smiled weakly at the idea of gentle little Spotty bucking or throwing anyone, but then he began to cry again when he remembered it was his last chance for a long time to exercise Spotty, and he was so weak he couldn't stay on his back. He finally said to his mother, "Spotty did not buck or throw me. It's just I'm so tired I cannot stay on his back. I rolled off and now I can't get back on, and it's my turn to exercise him. And I won't have another turn for a long time." Alan's mother said, "See here, Alan, this all comes from your turning into Slow-Eater-Tiny-Bite taker, and if you want to ride Spotty this afternoon, you will have to come in the house and eat something." She tied Spotty to the fence, picked Alan up, carried him into the house, and set him in the breakfast nook. He leaned back weak. He leaned weakly back against the wall and closed his eyes. His mother began rattling pans, turning on burners, and pretty soon she handed him a drop cup filled with cream of tomato soup and the penny plate with 2 cracker crumbs on it. She said, "Now drink this soup in one gulp and put both these crumbs in your mouth at once." Alan did as he was told and then leaned back and closed his eyes again. Then his mother handed him a thimble filled with milk and a tiny peanut butter sandwich on the dollar plate. She said, "Drink this milk in one swallow and put that whole sandwich in your mouth." Alan did and was surprised to find he didn't feel quite so tired. He leaned back, but he kept his eyes open. Then his mother handed him the doll cup filled with soup and the doll plate filled with some cottage cheese on it. "Drink that soup right down, and here is a large—" I know my hand's in the way. "Fork. I want that cottage cheese eaten in 2 bites." Alan did as he was told. My, but he was feeling strong. He could sit up without leaning back, and oddly enough, he was very hungry. His mother handed him the after-dinner coffee cup filled with milk and the saucer plate with a piece of gingerbread on it. Alan didn't have to be told how to eat and drink these. He took large, hungry bites and began swishing gulps, and the dishes were empty. His mother said, "Do you feel better, dear? Have you had enough lunch?" Alan said, "I feel much better, Mother, but I am still very hungry. May I please have a large bowl of soup and a large glass of milk?" "Of course, dear," said his mother, and she quickly filled a large bowl. She quickly filled a large bowl with soup and a large glass with milk. Alan ate every drop of soup and drank every drop of milk, and then jumped up from the table, saying, "Oh, Mother, I bet Spotty's hungry. Shall I take him some soup?" "No, dear," said his mother. "I think that Spotty would prefer an apple and some lumps of sugar." So they fed Spotty, and then Alan climbed his back and rode proudly away, sitting up very straight and holding on to the reins with one hand. When he reached the corner by Patsy's house, his mother called him to come back. He turned Spotty around and steered him up to the gate, and his mother came out with the basket of Slow-Eater-Tiny-Bite taker dishes. "Would you mind returning these to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle?" she asked. "Not at all," said Alan graciously. "Just hand me the basket. I'll put it here in front of me and hold it with this hand. You see, Mother, I only use one hand to steer now." He carefully arranged the basket, kissed his mother, clucked to Spotty, and away they went in a very slow walk towards Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house. And that, my friend, is the end of the Slow Eater Tiny Bite Cure. I will be continuing to read Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle on Wednesdays beginning next week. Thank you and have a beautiful day. Bye.